Thanks for joining us today. My name is Juanetta Ayers. I'm Executive Director for Commonwealth North. I got some new marching orders directly from the Admiral when we got here, so I'm going to do some of the preliminary comments, and then I'll bring Tom up to do an introduction of our guests today. So we want to welcome you, those of you here in the room with us at the Petroleum Club, and also those of you that are online with us. Thanks for being here today. We also want to acknowledge that our program today originates from Anchorage, which is the traditional homeland of the Dena'ina Athabascan, and also that Alaska is, of course, home, the traditional homeland to 228 federally recognized Alaska Native tribes. We also want to acknowledge Carol Anderson and Margaret King, who are with us today to help with registration and room setup, and we appreciate their assistance each and every time they join us. And then we also want to acknowledge our sponsors today, Alaska Communications and ConocoPhillips Alaska. So please join me in welcoming them. And of course, for those of you that are members, we thank you for your ongoing support. Commonwealth North is a membership-based organization, and your support definitely drives what we do. For those of you that are not members, we invite you to join us in learning about Alaska's most critical issues and becoming more involved as citizens. And I apologize, I didn't get the membership applications out on the table, but we'll have some at the exit when you leave the room today. Or if you have any questions at all, I'd be happy to talk to you about joining Commonwealth North. So just by way of introduction about our program, of course, during the last legislative session, Senate Bill 48 was passed by the legislature, and it now gives the state of Alaska the authority to develop carbon management projects on state land, sell carbon offset credits, and to lease state lands for carbon management purposes. Still pending in the legislature is other legislation that would authorize the state to develop carbon capture, utilization, and storage projects, or CCUS projects. So according to Morgan Stanley, the voluntary carbon offset market is expected to grow from an estimated $2 billion, that was the estimate in 2020. It'll reach $100 billion by 2030 and continue to grow to $250 billion in 2050. So it's kind of a meteoric rise expected in the voluntary carbon offset market. As I mentioned, still pending is the governor's proposal to enter the CCUS market. That market is roughly the same size as the carbon offset market right now, about $2 billion. But it's also projected to grow to approximately $11 billion by 2028. So in relatively short order, some additional growth there. So today we are going to hear from Commissioner John Boyle for the Alaska Department of Natural Resources. He and his team are going to be carrying out this new authority and planning how to position Alaska for carbon markets and determine how the state's forests and tidelands will be managed under the provisions of SB 48, and of course continuing to champion the CCUS legislation. With that, I'd like to bring up Tom Garrett, who's going to formally introduce Commissioner Boyle. Tom?
Thanks, Juanetta. Thank you all for coming. And by the way, they're going to be serving your lunch, so eat. Okay, we're coming. And you know, I'm honored to have the commissioner here for us today. You know, as Juanetta said, right now our lanes of Commonwealth go to things like energy, fiscal policy, healthcare, which is an emerging issue on a number of fronts, and you know, things like Arctic. But to try and illuminate better some of these issues that are going to affect across the state, pretty much everybody here directly or indirectly, whether they make the top and get a spotlight on some of them. So Juanetta mentioned about the commissioner. You know, I had a couple of thoughts. And if you think about his portfolio, Alaska being Alaska, the person in charge of managing the lands and waters, it's the biggest such portfolio in the country, right? Just because of the size of Alaska, the scope of the lands and waters we're talking about, the resources that we have, it's enormous and it's not simple. There are a lot of competing interests around a lot of them, and John's position is key to successfully managing those resources forward for the benefit of the state and everybody here. And it's tough. So I want to appreciate the effort. You don't see the backside stuff, but it's tough and he's quite capable. By way of background, just if you don't know him, he's a graduate of Brigham Young University. He has a degree in business management and finance, as well as a Juris Doctor. He, when he was in law school at Brigham, was also president of the Natural Resources Law Society. So for a long time, he's been working in that space. Here, he's most recently been with Santos as the director of government relations. And prior to that, with the North Slope Borough, where he started out as an assistant attorney up there at the audit, and then migrated up to government relations. Again, you think of the resources that are impacted there. So what it says to me is he's got a lot of experience in this area, a lot of time, and with a tough job. I'm glad that he's in the position he's in. And John, we want to welcome you to the Commonwealth. We're delighted to have you. But we'll give you the floor.
Well, thank you for the kind words and for the introduction. It certainly is a tough job, but as former Commissioner Bailash will tell you, it's also the best job in the state. So I'm privileged to follow after a number of great DNR commissioners, and I'm also humbled by that responsibility to manage our lands and resources, because it is humbling. One of the things that we're currently working on at DNR is this concept of DNR 2033. It's kind of our vision for the future. And the messaging that I'm sharing with my fellow 1,200 employees at DNR is that all of us have the ability to shape and transform Alaska's future. And we really do is the managers of land and resources, the decisions that we make and our commitment to looking to ways to monetize and develop and conserve those resources for the benefit of all Alaskans really have an outsized influence on where the state can go in the future. And so we're really looking forward to delivering on that and to continue to find ways to make Alaska a great place to live. And I guess I don't have a clicker, right?
Yeah, you're gonna have to tell me and I'll advance.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can go ahead and jump into I guess our first slide, which really will cover the basics of carbon management. I'm going to try to keep my notes somewhere where I can still read them and go along with the slides. Yeah, if you go to the next slide, please. There we go. So we'll start with the basics of carbon management. And we're in essence talking about two different types of carbon management, both of which leverage kind of our natural resource and our land base, and we believe have a lot of potential here in the state. So first, we have our nature-based offsets. Those are what we're going to be looking at and referring to when we talk about our state's forests and our state's emerged lands and things of that nature. And then we've also got our geologic sequestration opportunities with carbon dioxide that's actually captured at the source and then ultimately stored underground. So those are sort of the two realms, the two areas that we talk about. So during the legislative session, we kind of had the trees bill, which is what offsets was colloquially referred to, and then we have the underground bill or the sequestration bill. So we were successful in seeing the trees bill across the line, and we'll now be shifting our focus this next session on the underground portion. So I guess we'll start with this brief overview of carbon management. In essence, you know, what we see is global focus on reducing carbon, either through sort of net zero targets that are set by a number of companies voluntarily, or of course through regulation and kind of government drive to meet Paris Climate Accord agreements or things of that nature. And so in order to accomplish these goals, you have a suite of tools that can be used to help mitigate carbon, whether you're using offsets or nature-based opportunities to absorb additional carbon out of the atmosphere, or whether we're looking at mechanical sources that can actually capture it at those point sources and then ultimately direct that underground to where it can be stored for geologically significant periods of time. And Alaska really, again, has incredible potential in both of these realms. So, you know, on the left, you see the smokestack that represents kind of one source of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere from that, I guess, power generating opportunities there. And you can see that you, again, in the middle side, you have an option that if you have the right technology put together, you can capture that carbon and sequester it underground. Or in certain cases, the technology just doesn't exist, or it's not cost effective, or there's not a great mechanism by which you can capture that carbon emission from that operation. I'm thinking more in lines of commercial travel. So in those types of instances, you don't have the mechanical option to actually capture your carbon. So you're going to have to look at what are ways that we can manage lands and forests and sort of mariculture-based opportunities that absorb, that through our management would absorb additional carbon that can then offset kind of our core emissions. And that's really what we're looking at when we talk about these opportunities. So if we can turn to the next slide, please. So first we'll pivot over and talk about nature-based carbon offsets, since that's the legislation that we've got across the line, and that's currently what we're focused on now. Go to the next slide, please. And again, a lot of people ask, like, what is a carbon credit? How does all this work? And is this funny money? Is this like Bitcoin, or, you know, are these NFTs, right? How is it that the state's actually monetizing this particular resource? And in general, this just sort of, I guess, is a simple graphic, but it generally shows how it works. So you've got your companies, your emitters that are producing carbon dioxide that, again, want to achieve some kind of net zero standard. So they look, for instance, to some kind of natural option like trees, which of course then pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They then store that carbon either in the ground or as part of the trees themselves as they grow bigger and longer. And ultimately, that delta, that additional carbon that is absorbed out of the atmosphere based on our management of these natural resources, then are monetized through the creation of a credit, which represents generally 1 ton of carbon dioxide that has been pulled out of the atmosphere. Those credits then have a monetary value for companies, again, that are looking to achieve that net zero standard. They can use those credits and they can hold on to them if they think the value of the credits are going to increase over time, or they can sell them or what have you. There's an entire market structure kind of built around the trading of that. But in essence, that's what a carbon market is and how it operates. And the state of Alaska, even though we're fairly new to this game, we're not new to it from the standpoint of other Alaskan organizations. Tom Maloney up front, who represented ATNA. ATNA back in 2016 was leading the way with carbon offset projects on ATNA land. Saw Anthony Malott online. Alaska was another one of our Alaska Native corporations that was embarked in this endeavor. So we're really sort of following their examples on how it is that we can monetize our natural resource portfolio in a different way, similar to how we saw some of our Alaska Native corporations do the same. If we can turn to the next slide, please. So this slide really just kind of goes over the basics of how a carbon-based offset project comes together. Ultimately, it starts with the concept. You know, a landowner and or a developer can kind of come together. They do sort of a feasibility analysis or study. They say, hey, we think this area of forest would be ideal to manage for carbon offset purposes, and that kind of gets started. That then kicks us into development, where, you know, the proponents are selecting the different sort of methodologies that are used. These are sort of the specific rules that govern carbon management programs. They conduct an inventory and computer modeling of the areas, which is Tom would tell you is pretty in-depth, intensive process. I mean, you literally are flying people out to different test plots in an area of forest, and they've got tape measures and whatnot, and they're measuring trees, and they're figuring out they're calculating how much carbon those trees are absorbing on a year-to-year basis and kind of plugging all that in. That then moves forward into kind of a project registration phase where you have a third-party validator that is looking at the project design and the verification of those emission benefits. The proponent would then register a project with a particular registry that would get approval. That then leads to kind of the next step in terms of the registry. Once it's approved, the project will then start issuing credits to that proponent or developer, whatever the case may be. And then, of course, at that point, the project developer has the opportunity to sell that to different buyers. And then ultimately, you can then apply these credits in various scenarios of where it's important for them to ensure that they're meeting their climate goals and that they're not kind of double counting or double dipping on their carbon emissions. So I think we can go ahead and move to the next slide if you don't mind. So as was mentioned earlier, all of the analysis shows that demand for these voluntary carbon credits is expected to grow. So we've already seen forecasts that the market will be some 5 times larger by 2030 than it already was in 2022. And as you can see, even from 2021 to 2022, there was a lot of growth in that particular market. One of the questions that we get asked a lot was, who are buying these credits? And generally what we're seeing is that there's a lot of large corporations, again, like I mentioned, that set these voluntary internal emissions reduction goals for themselves. And these are names that you're familiar with, L'Oreal, JP Morgan, Delta Airlines, Disney, Amazon, Google. All of these types of companies have made these types of commitments. And generally, as you look through an index of the S&P 500, most of the larger corporations around the world have sort of set these targets for themselves. But to meet these goals, corporations have to look for ways to either directly reduce their emissions in terms of we're going to build more energy efficient buildings, or we're going to create more energy efficient processes, or we're going to deploy some other technology that helps us actually remove carbon out of the processing or the manufacturing process that we have, or assuming that they can't, that those actions in and of themselves are insufficient to help them reach that net zero goal, they then need to pivot towards looking to offsets to kind of help them meet that. And so again, companies look to purchase these credits, which represent that 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide that's removed out of the atmosphere, and then they can apply them against their emissions ledger. They're basically balancing their account. And as we know, carbon dioxide is not it's not localized to one given area. So if you can absorb an additional 1 ton of carbon out of the atmosphere in Alaska and sequester it here, that 1 ton of carbon is still good for counting against somebody's emissions in California or Texas or Paris or wherever they happen to live. So it's a global issue that people are looking to address, but our local solutions in being able to offer that has global applicability, of course. We can turn to the next slide, please. So as was mentioned, Senate Bill 48 became law in May of this year. So currently, right now, we at DNR are underway in promulgating the regulations that will sort of govern this process. Once we kind of get our initial draft of the regulations, those will be noticed for public comment. I believe an element of our regs are already out for public comment right now. And then ultimately the state will look to consider potential projects. And the one thing that, I'll say at least kind of being at the tip of the spear of the legislative process, we were really pleased to see almost near unanimous approval of this concept by the legislature. The SB 48 passed 58-2. And I really give a lot of credit to my team, Rena Miller, who's my special assistant, my deputy commissioner, John Prother, Brett Goodrum, and our division directors that were instrumental in going down to Juneau and helping walk legislators through what it is that we're looking at with carbon management, and how we feel that that really fits in with DNR's responsibility to develop Alaska's resources to the maximum benefit of its people. And so with SB 48 in particular, the state has two sort of opportunities. One is we can lease state lands for developers that are interested in developing a carbon offset project. So as the Admiral mentioned, Alaska has a very large land base. I'm responsible for managing 100 million acres of those state lands. Tens of millions of those acres are forested. And so we have a lot of opportunity to look to those tens of millions of acres for areas that really make sense for carbon offset purposes. Alternatively, the state could take a more active role in terms of actually developing some of these carbon offset projects ourselves. And so one of the patterns we've seen, at least from our Alaska Native corporations, is that sometimes initially they allow a developer to kind of come in and develop the project, to sort of learn the process and the ins and outs of all of that. And then after they've seen that developer successfully go through and put a carbon offset project into play, the Native corporations then pivot themselves to doing a lot of that work themselves so that they can potentially share in more of the upside. And so the state wants to be nimble and flexible in terms of how we engage in this, but we do see a lot of opportunities to look at ways of how the state could play a role in this and really maximize the amount of revenue for the state. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So again, a lot of people are like, well, why is Alaska really involved in this? You know, what are we, if we become woke, are we just buying into some leftist agenda? Is this, you know, did you go to the World Economic Forum and get converted to some kind of ideology? And fundamentally, the answer is no. We just believe that this is really a good fit for Alaska. For one, it represents a new source of income. And I think many of you in this room have been involved in advocating for public policy at one time or another. And one of the things that we always talk about in the state is the need and the importance to help diversify our economy. And that's not to take away from oil and gas and the other industries in the state that are key and pivotal to providing for Alaska's economic well-being. But I think all of us could recognize that the more we can diversify our state's economy, the more that we can really look to monetize all of the state's natural resources, as opposed to maybe just a select few, the better off ultimately the state will be. The more protected we are against just sort of normal market fluctuations. And of course, I think we all can agree that more resources is a good thing. It gives us more money for education, gives us more money for police and fire services, and all of the things that we need to make our communities great places to live and our state a great place to enjoy. So from my perspective, is the person who, again, who's tasked with having a look at all of Alaska's natural resources. To me, carbon is one of those areas that does fall within our responsibility that I felt important that we look to opportunities to monetize this. And really, we see a lot of compatibility with our existing land and resource base, because one of the benefits from, I think, moving forward into the carbon offset realm is that enhanced forest management, for instance, not only can have carbon benefits in terms of you're helping trees and forests grow more healthily, but you can use that same process that by managing trees and by managing forests, if the conclusion of a carbon offset project, which might be 50, 60, or 70 years, whatever the case may be, you're then left with a stand of merchantable timber. Because as you start managing areas of forests for carbon offset, and maybe these are areas that were, for instance, reforesting after a wildfire, we can start targeting, you know, higher value species. So we're going to ensure that we go out and we replant with white spruce, for instance, so that we get more white spruce trees growing and maybe fewer cottonwoods or fewer aspen or fewer other trees. And that's not to say that we're gonna embark on this program where we have no natural forests in the state, but it's just to say that through enhanced forest management, we can manage our trees, we can manage our forests in a way that not only can we monetize the carbon benefit, if we go back to the previous slide, I can just skip that. Not only can we get the carbon benefit, but we can then actually start building out the state's timber stock. And to me, timber is one of those areas that I think the state really needs to focus on. The facts that I like to throw out is that last year the state brought in roughly $1.5 million of revenue from timber sales. We spent $120 million putting out wildfires on our state land. So if you look at it from kind of an asset management perspective, we have an asset that is costing us a lot more money than is bringing us benefit. And so for me, figuring out how we can right size, balance that equation out a little better through carbon offset projects and forest management, which can help improve the merchantability of trees, like I said, over time, which can help us mitigate wildfire danger through pruning and other kind of forest management practices. You start finding ways to kind of tip that balance to where we can monetize more of our timber resources, reduce costs associated with wildland firefighting, and also see benefit through carbon offset projects. Lastly, I guess it's important to note that this effort does not lock up land, and this does not institute emissions limits or cap and trade rules for laughter businesses. So areas of state land or state forests that are in carbon management are still open for hunting, for recreation, for most normal public uses. If you want to go out and cut down, harvest some trees for firewood, things like that, all of those types of activities are still apposite overall with our ability to have a carbon offset project in place. And not only that, you can also harvest timber, because as you set aside areas for carbon offset projects, every year the trees in that given area, they're growing bigger. You're getting new trees that are growing. So you start getting kind of a margin above that baseline that you're committed to maintaining, right? And within that margin, then it gives you opportunities if you decide to do some harvesting of timber, or you need to build a road or other pieces of infrastructure through that given project area, or you discover a really valuable mineral resource that you decide to mine. You have those opportunities to kind of repurpose and also utilize some of that margin to conduct those other activities. And ultimately, you discovered some kind of resource that required you to completely dismantle all of the trees. There are mechanisms by which you can take projects back out of circulation, I guess. But the way that we're setting this up, we have a high level of confidence that these will be done in a complementary way to all of our existing industry here in the state. If we could go to the next slide, please. So now that we've spent a lot of time focusing on the carbon-based offset, we can pivot now to talking about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. If we can go to the next slide, please. So again, this is just kind of a great slide that demonstrates the basics. We're looking at capturing carbon dioxide from fossil fuels or biomass fuel power station, industrial facilities, or directly from the air in some instances. And some companies are working on that technology. That captured CO2 then is moved, either being compressed and put into a ship or a barge, or moved by pipeline, whatever the case may be, from where it was generated ultimately to where the storage facility may be. And then ultimately that carbon is then permanently sequestered in underground geologic formation. So that's roughly the process that exists. And of course, the closer the storage is to where the carbon dioxide is captured, the better the economics and the more likely it is that those kind of projects would be successful. In Alaska, we see a number of opportunities where we think that would be the case. And not only that, I guess what I should say is that captured carbon has a lot of, every day it seems like we're seeing more and more uses that are accruing from captured carbon. So for instance, Many of you might be familiar, we have the Ugnu Formation on the North Slope, it's a very heavy viscous oil. We have tens of billions of barrels of that kind of oil in place, and companies and folks have been looking at that formation, trying to figure out ways to produce that economically for decades. And one of the latest kind of updates that we've got from the research team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and others that are working on that is that polymer flooding in conjunction with direct CO2 injection into that Ugnu formation has a very high efficiency in being able to help sweep through that particular formation and increase oil recovery from the Ugnu. Now, whether we're quite there where it's commercial or not, I couldn't tell you, but certainly the early indications are that some of these technologies combined actually could make a very strong case for how we could produce some of these heavy and viscous oils on the North Slope, which again would be a major game changer for the state, assuming that we could make the economics of that work. So if we could go to the next slide. Fundamentally, however, Alaska has the rocks, and that's true when it comes to our oil and gas, and it's also true when it comes to just plain geologic storage potential. Our estimations are that in the Cook Inlet alone, the state of Alaska has some 50 gigatons worth of storage capacity, and that's what we know just sort of based on our understanding of the geology of that basin. And to give you a context of how big 50 gigatons is, that's more carbon dioxide than the country of Japan will emit in a 50-year period of time. So this is an inordinate amount of carbon storage potential right here in our backyard in Cook Inlet. And that just includes what we know about in Cook Inlet from the data that we've gathered over the years from oil and gas operations. That doesn't include looking even more in depth at the resources and looking at other types of geologic formations, whether that be saline aquifers or deep unminable coal seams, both of which have high potential for sequestering carbon. We think that as the state actually starts making efforts to really look at those particular resources, that we'll likely find that our storage potential is even higher than it already is. And of course, the North Slope is kind of off the chart, right? At least 1,000 gigatons, probably more. Again, when we actually start looking into it. And so where we really see Alaska playing a strategic role is that as we look to countries like Japan and South Korea, they're both signatories to the Paris Climate Accords. They've both committed to reducing their nation's emissions by a significant amount in the upcoming decades. They don't have good places to store their carbon. They don't really have the geology, and they don't have many good alternatives on where they can put their carbon. So one of the, I think, most strategic partnerships that we as the state can make is really working with our allies like Japan, like South Korea, to where in the hopeful likelihood that we get the AKLNG project across the line and become an exporter of LNG and potentially hydrogen and ammonia to Asia, we would then backhaul products like CO2 from those Asian countries and use that, sequester that here in the state and kind of provide that value chain to where we're exporting already very low cost or low carbon energy to our Asian allies, and then we're then importing their CO2. And under the Paris Climate Accord, there's a provision that allows for countries to enter into these bilateral agreements called internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. And one of the things that we're pursuing with our delegation and the federal government is looking at their appetite to engage with our allies on this so that we can form that strategic partnership or relationship with Japan and South Korea and be an underpinner or a guarantor of their carbon reduction goals. And that, I think, would be not only a major revenue generator for the state, but again, enable Alaska to position itself as a very strategic partner when it comes to providing energy and also enabling them to reach their carbon reduction goals. And of course, within the state, we also have our own emitters as well. So as we look to coal-fired power plants, as we look to our operators on the slope, any other emitters in the state, certainly we want to provide opportunities for them to manage their carbon if that falls in line with what their corporate objectives are. If we could go to the next slide, please. And again, we see the demand from some of this. So most of the names up on the screen, folks in this room are probably familiar with. These are companies that have either made corporate net zero targets or at least commitments to sort of applying industry standards to their operations. And we see, again, kind of an opportunity here to work with investors and companies that are already in the state to help them meet those goals, whether that's through providing opportunities with state lands on carbon offset projects, or really if that's through enabling them to utilize carbon capture and storage technologies in their own operations to sequester carbon. So we definitely see this as a big piece. And again, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't point out with AKLNG in particular, having, as that project as it is, needs to strip the CO2 out of the gas on the North Slope and sequester it. Having this framework in place, we think will better support that project. The latest infrastructure, I can't remember which, I don't remember if it's the IRA or one of the recent acts that passed through Congress, increased the amount of 45Q tax credits available to companies who are either capturing carbon and usually capturing carbon dioxide, I should say, and using it for enhanced oil recovery, or capturing carbon dioxide and sequestering it, or for direct air capture technology. But there's a lot of incentives available out there right now, currently through the federal government for that activity. And again, the state wanted to be in a position to enable that type of business to move forward to better support our current industrial kind of clientele in the state. If we could go to the next slide, please. And again, just this kind of gives you a nice kind of pictorial of what carbon dioxide injection looks like. We have a lot of expertise in the state, right? We have folks that understand the subsurface well. We have a lot of folks that understand drilling really well. The state also has unified ownership. So unlike North Dakota or Texas or Louisiana, where you might have multitude different owners of the surface estates and different owners of the subsurface estate, in so many areas in Alaska, the state is the owner of both the surface and the subsurface. In addition, because the oil and gas industry is still relatively young in the state, we also have really good records. So in some of these geologic formations, particularly in our depleted oil and gas basins, we have good well logs and good data in terms of where all the areas that these geologic formations have been perforated, for instance. And that actually also plays a big part in terms of having some assurance on the safety and the efficacy of sequestering carbon when you know that you have these wells that you kind of need to look out for, or you know this is an area that has never been drilled. You have a lot more confidence in terms of that particular formation's ability to sequester that carbon safely without any of it escaping, because you just didn't know that somebody drilled a well there way back in the day before a lot of good records were kept. I think again, this kind of, I think I've hit generally on most of these points. I guess I would just lastly say that we really pride ourselves on Alaska with our environmental stewardship. When you go to the North Slope and you get into a vehicle and you park it, you slide a little duck pond underneath to ensure that any drops of oil or other fluid are contained. And you see that kind of commitment to protecting the environment, protecting the wildlife, and so on and so forth. It's who we are, and we take pride in that because we love the state, and we love clean air, and we love clean water, and we love to hunt and fish and enjoy our land and not see them polluted. To me, this is just gives us another arrow to our quiver in terms of what is this Alaska standard. This is how we do business, and looking at ways to where we can lower the carbon intensity of the activities that take place here, I think just bolster that message. And as you make the argument to folks about we're very passionate about the energy transition. I say the argument is that understanding that we're not going to flip on a dime in terms of going from hydrocarbon-based energy to renewables overnight, and that we're going to have a period of time for the foreseeable future where we will absolutely need more oil and gas molecules to supply the world with the energy that it needs. If you're going to develop that energy anywhere, it should be in a place like Alaska, where it's done responsibly, where there are social benefits that accrue, where we are looking to manage the carbon elements to it, and so on and so forth. So our pitches to investors, as I've gone with the Commissioner of Revenue to talk to ratings agencies and other investors on Wall Street, or down in Houston at CERAWeek or whatever, it's really this message of Alaska is absolutely the kind of place that if you're concerned about your company's ethos in developing responsibly and bringing benefit to people and respecting the environment, Alaska is absolutely someplace that needs to be on your radar. Go to the next slide, please. And again, we are not the first to run and jump on this. As you can see, there's already a couple states, North Dakota and Wyoming, that have what's called Class 6 primacy. So the injection of carbon dioxide is managed or regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. The EPA has the authority to regulate that activity, but they are interested in devolving that authority to the states. In fact, they've set $50 million aside to help support state applications for primacy. And part of the Senate Bill 48 that we had passed this last session gives the state the authority, AOGCC, the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, in particular, the authority to apply for EPA for Class 6 well primacy. So our hope is hopefully within the next year or two, AOGCC will get that primacy, and then we'll be tasked with the actual regulation of Class 6 injection. But as you can see, a number of other states have applied or are applying, and I think more and more that the federal government is recognizing that this technology and promoting this activity is a good thing overall. And so there's a lot of federal support there for us to move forward relatively quickly on that front. If we could go to the next slide, please. So a lot of folks ask, how did you guys come up with these concepts and ideas? Again, this was really part of a collaborative effort with the university, with the industry, with a number of other stakeholders in other states and institutions where they've already been looking at this to really create a strong framework for what we feel like is opposite with what industry needs, but also, of course, is done in a way that can ensure safety and responsibility, and also provide opportunities for Alaskans. So we were very pleased to continue to work with these stakeholder groups, and we will continue to engage with these groups, particularly next year as assuming we're successful in the legislature, which I have all confidence that we will be, and we promulgate the regulations. We'll continue to reach out to ensure that we put together a framework that works well for users here in the state. I think we can go to the next slide. Oh, okay, so we got one more. So again, like I mentioned, our really kind of our next steps is enabling the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to be successful in getting that delegation of authority from the EPA. They've already kicked off that application process, and we continue to support them in that. We are working as well on kind of the interplay of the federal 45Q tax credits with our state income tax code, and working through some issues with that, since we know that those are important considerations for the legislature to consider this next session. But again, we're really optimistic that we've got a great opportunity here, and we're already seeing a lot of interest from companies that been asking us, hey, what's the status of this? We're quite interested to get involved. So we are definitely prioritizing this. This will be our number one kind of legislative ask this next session. And in fact, we're going to be doing a lot of work in the interim with legislators to just kind of continue to educate and work through some of these issues so that as soon as session gathers in, we'll be ready to hit the ground running on advancing this piece of legislation. All right, and with that, we get to take a little bit of a break and take questions. I guess, are you and I sitting up here, Admiral, or are we?
Yeah.
How do you want to do that?
Well, you can do that, but you know what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna point at you. But no matter how you handle it online. Okay, so we're going to read first.
Yeah.
Okay, I see a hand raised up there, two actually. There's note cards.
Yeah, we've got note cards on the table, so you can write your questions down and I'll kind of direct those. So we've got-
So could you expand a little bit on project registration? Are there standards and compliance checks? How does that actually work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sorry for the lot for here, double twisting it. Yes, there are these independent kind of third-party verifiers like the American Carbon Registry, Vera. There's a whole suite of them, and they have a set of standards and protocols that they've established that are generally kind of recognizable, at least around the industry, in terms of these are durable, verifiable standards that people have confidence. I think there has been a lot of media around the efficacy of some carbon offset projects, particularly nature-based offset projects. We've seen a lot of developing nations kind of rush into this area, like in West Africa or South America, other places where they're working to do this, where there's some level of skepticism over whether or not they're actually managing their forests to absorb more carbon, or if they're just kind of hiding the ball a little bit. One of the reasons why we actually think Alaska will have a competitive advantage in this realm and actually enjoy a premium on on the credits that we may sell in the voluntary market is that having a government entity like DNR, like the state of Alaska, and their good faith and credit standing behind carbon offset projects, it provides the investors or the purchasers of these credits with a lot of confidence that these programs are being done and managed in a way, excuse me, that actually will bring the benefit that they want to see, which of course is additional carbon emitted or absorbed out of the atmosphere.
Okay, another opportunity. Do you have any concerns around seismic activity in the state, particularly in the Cook Inlet region?
Yeah, I always love that question. The Cook Inlet Basin is a very highly seismic basin, right? We all know that. We've lived up here for multiple earthquakes, even pretty big ones in the last few years. We do have a high level of confidence. When carbon dioxide is injected at the depths and the pressures it enters in what's called like a supercritical state. So it's not quite a gas and it's not quite a liquid. The instances where there have been induced seismicity in other areas like the lower 48 have generally involved things like injecting wastewater like directly into faults and things like that. We have a lot of, I should say by we I mean like the really smart geologists and geophysicists that work for DNR, not schmuck commissioners. They're the ones that really, they say, look, this is one, we know that these geographic traps and seals that exist in the Cook Inlet, even though that's a very highly seismically active area, those traps and seals have been effective at storing natural gas and oil for millions of years, geologically significant periods of time, is how they put it. So we have a high level of confidence that CO2 can be sequestered in these same traps and seals, and also be confident that that CO2 will stay there for geologically significant periods of time.
Thanks, Commissioner. So, how about, you talked about monetization? Do you have any revenue projections over the next 10, 20, or 30 years on what the state can expect to monetize from this asset?
Yeah, no, I always appreciate that question. The best part about being in DNR is that I don't have to come up with revenue projections. That's the Department of Revenue. My job is just to look at opportunities to monetize resources. We have endeavored to be deliberately circumspect in terms of our revenue projections. We certainly believe that this will be a great opportunity for the state. We certainly believe with a high level of confidence that the state is going to bring in more money than it's going to cost us to manage and regulate this activity. But I'm very cautious to throw out any numbers. I think there's a number of different factors involved. We're all very confident though that the opportunity is there, and I think over time it'll become more and more clear that carbon will have a really big role to play in terms of new state revenues and things of that nature.
So thanks for a great presentation on the benefits. And you talk about potential for value-add industries that would be associated with carbon capture and investment.
Now, that's a great question as well. And honestly, that's a question that I think about a lot in terms of all of Alaska's resource space, whether we're talking about mining, whether we're talking about forestry, mariculture, what have you. It's really, Alaska's operated so long on this sort of, I don't want to say colonial model, but it's been a model where natural resources are extracted out of the state and then they're shipped, right? You have raw logs that are harvested in the Tongass and they're sent to Asia for milling, or we have a lot of mineral ore that's mined, but that's sent off to smelters in Canada or in Asia, and where it's refined and processed and the value chain of that. And so, yeah, we do see opportunities kind of with value added, with particularly around CCUS. Like I said, there's a lot of interesting industrial applications associated with sequester or with kind of captured carbon. We would like to see that developed here, particularly if we can pair that with the AKLNG project and get hydrogen and ammonia and other types of processing done. But it's certainly our interest and our focus to try to figure out as many ways as we can entice and enhance opportunities for value-added processing and manufacturing here to attract, again, that diversified jobs and economic base, we'd say.
So there's a market at play here, global, as you mentioned. But how, or are you in a position to manage that market space so we don't sell our resources too soon or too late?
Yeah, that's a great question too. The good news is I have a lot of really smart people that work for me, and there's a lot of really smart people that work for the state in general. Our intent is to try to be very strategic in all of this, particularly with carbon management. Like I said, I see the biggest opportunities likely with these kind of international partnerships where we offer carbon offset projects at big scales that would fit in with these particular countries or maybe major emitting industries in their state or in their borders for carbon reduction goals. So our intent is not necessarily to look for the quickest buck. It's really to look at what will offer the state the best returns on the long run, what will enable the state, what will be best or most complementary to existing infrastructure and industry and business in the state. So we want to be very thoughtful on how we approach carbon management to ensure that, again, we're maximizing the value of this resource, not just, oh, we're going to hurry to get $1 tomorrow.
So I have two more questions, and we'll try to keep you on track here. Can you talk a little bit about what direct and indirect obligations you would expect from contracts that are created in this space?
Yeah, in general, I actually got Tom and Anthony, who I think would be better experts than me on the contractual obligations that are often associated with this. But in general, you're committing to manage, in terms of carbon offsets, you're committing to manage a given area of land in a certain way for a certain period of time. So there are obligations, of course, to ensure that you're not over harvesting trees in that area or doing any other activities that are inapposite in terms of the contractor. Once they've kind of established a baseline in terms of the amount of carbon that particular area needs to absorb out of the atmosphere every year, your contractual obligations, I think, are generally framed around maintaining that baseline so that the credits that have been issued, then of course, are within what they say they're doing, which is taking that carbon.
Let's say the last question is an audience participation question, because I can't read it. Okay? So the question, I feel like I'm back in fourth grade, and my teacher at one point called me up to the front of the room and gave me an A on paper and congratulated me in front of the whole class. This was the first time she could read what I had written. And, anyway, I still remember that. But in any case, how are you going to deal with the issue of probability or additionality for offsets? Who asked that question? Okay, you want to just explain what that means?
Yeah, sure. So quality is important to quality of off. You know, based on people think that some people want to do project, but you have to sell capital. You not really do anything. Sometimes you're one person to be there for a lot of good projects, for functionality. Because that really is the quality of the project.
Yeah, so he's asking about additionality, which again is a key component when we talk about carbon offset projects generally that are involving forestry. That is, you kind of have your business as usual baseline. That is what you've always been doing with your forests or with your land. Additionality says, hey, if I go out and I start managing this differently, or I forego doing certain activities that I've normally been doing in this land, then that land's ability to then absorb more carbon increases over sort of the baseline or the sort of business as usual case. And so I think Alaska has a lot of opportunities to show additionality, again, through enhanced forest management and how we maybe might go out and be more proactive, particularly with reforestation versus just kind of natural revegetation. When we look at forests in the more of the boreal forests here in the interior, we've got a lot of areas, for instance, right now in the Matsu and Kenai that have been impacted by the spruce bark beetle. So if we're to go out and cut down those dead trees and render that lumber and go out and replant and again start managing forests differently. I mean, there's all sorts of things from using new fertilization techniques to utilizing genetics research to get trees to grow faster. There's a suite of options that our forestry folks are looking at that, again, would kind of fit in line with these various protocols that I think would demonstrate additionality and sort of the state's efforts to ensure that we are actually doing what we say that we're doing, which is absorbing additional carbon out of the atmosphere.
So I want to thank you again, Commissioner, for spending some time with us and a great presentation and sharing your perspective. And thank all of you for joining us, and how about a big round of applause for the state of Alaska. And you know, let Juanetta do a wrap here. But thank you all for coming. It's good to see you here, and we'll keep following this issue as it emerges over the next couple of years.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Boyle and Tom Barrett. Appreciate it. Just a couple of quick closing comments. We are in the process of scheduling a couple of study sessions, one for the Fiscal Policy Study Group. Cheryl Kraska, who's the co-chair of that along with Jennifer Johnson, are leading that effort and looking at opportunity to update the Alaska Budget Choices Project, which we did a couple of years ago to engage Alaskans in balancing the budget. And this time maybe more from a revenue perspective. And we're also working with the Energy Policy Study Group on an upcoming session to look at the Prove It Act, which would do a vast research project on product level emissions and look at how those products are produced in key trading partner countries and look at a border adjusted carbon tax to equalize that market. And then we're looking for locations, meeting rooms. If you have a meeting room that's available, we would love to talk to you about using that for some of these sessions. Oh, I should mention Scott Kendall is here with us, and he's going to be our speaker for that Prove It Act presentation. So those are upcoming. And then on August 23, if you would join us, we're going to be looking at public sector and employment. What's the churn rate there? What is that costing the state of Alaska? And looking at what other states are doing to recruit and retain public sector employees. And then we'll also hear from Senator Kathy Diesel and former state representative Chuck Pop on a proposal to reinstitute a defined benefits pension plan. So please watch your email for that information and more. All of it's available at commonwealthnorth.org. And again, thank you to Alaska Communications and Commonwealth Alaska for making today's program possible. And again, to our speaker, Commissioner John Boyle, and his staff for making today's presentation. Thanks, everybody.